Welcome in this follow-up video about Yakuza films. I haven't done any follow-up video for a little while, so let me just remind you quickly what is the concept of this kind of video. The idea is simply to react to some of the questions that the original video has generated, or some comments which are worthy to dig a bit deeper and to extend and to go into more details about the subject which was originally discussed in the main video, being in this case the Yakuza films. And so I got a few questions which are in my opinion quite interesting to delve into. So let's start with one from Geronimo, who asked me if there were some other genre of Japanese cinema which could be used in order to analyze the evolution of Japanese society. And the answer is, of course, yes. And the answer is actually any genre can be used in order to have this kind of analysis. You can take, for example, the samurai genre, and if you compare the 47 Ronins made by Mizoguchi during the wartime, obviously the concepts which are put forward in this film are in line with what the government at the time wanted the Japanese people to obey, or at least to respect or to follow. And if we continue in this direction, we can look at a movie like Harakiri by Masaki Kobayashi, which is kind of the complete opposite of the 47 Ronins by Mizoguchi, and which shows that the 60s were a time of not necessarily opposition, but a time of strong questions about authority, about the democracy in Japan, about the decisions made by the government, these kind of things. And you can apply this kind of logic to any genre, to any other films. In this case I was talking about samurai films, so you can do the same kind of analysis with each decade and see how they were reflecting the conflict, the questions that Japanese society was asking at the time. And that's an exercise you can do with any genre, and which you can do with any country as well. You can do it with the US, you can do it with any European cinema. You can apply it, for example, with Italy, with their Poliziotti, their cop film from the 70s, these kind of things. It's really like criticism 101, I would say. It's fairly easy to do if you are aware of the evolution of the country and what was happening from a historical, political, and sociological point of view. If you need also to be aware of maybe sometimes some cases which may have been fairly trivial, but which may have had an impact on the public, on the audience. That may be a murder, that may be this kind of stories. And so if you are aware of these kind of things, you can quite easily connect any genre, any film which was made around that time to this kind of issues which were heavily discussed back then. So to sum it up, you can certainly do it with many other genre of Japanese cinema, and as I said, to many other genre of any cinema in the world. Then we had Michel Cocteau, who was asking my opinion about two recent films, Blood of the Wolves, the first one, which was made in 2018, if I remember correctly, and its sequel, which is The Blood of Wolves Level 2, made this year, 2021. Just for those of you who don't know about those films, so they are recent cops and Yakuza films. Blood of Wolves, the first one, is actually an adaptation of a very successful book by Yuko Yuzuki, and she's a very famous writer specialized in this kind of cop Yakuza stories. That's actually a reason why I'm optimistic about the evolution of Yakuza film. Even if the output of Yakuza film in Japan has certainly decreased compared to the 60s, compared to the 70s, there are still enough stories around the Yakuza in order for cinema to pick and to continue producing Yakuza films. And there is a very active, very vibrant literary scene with many writers doing very successful and very interesting cops and Yakuza stories, which are usually quite dark. And so the cinema in Japan can easily select some of them and make some adaptation, and that's exactly what they did with the first Blood of the Wolves. The second one actually is not an adaptation, and it's an original work from the director Kazuya Shiraishi. My opinion on this film is that they are pretty good. You can see that they have some pretty decent budget, that they have a very good technique when it comes to the photography, when it comes to the direction, and they also actually I haven't read the book yet. I still have to. It's on my to read pile, but from my understanding it's quite dark, and it seems, at least from what I can see, the movie is quite dark as well, so it seems like it's faithful to the original material, and that's something, of course, that I can only enjoy. It's bloody, it's a bit sadistic sometimes. You have some characters which are clearly borderline. The main character is a cop who is a bit of a dirty cop, a bit superficially corrupted. It's a bit more complicated than that, but he is certainly shady. For those of you who are into Hong Kong cinema, there is a bit of a Beast Cop vibe, Beast Cop by Gordon Chan, in which you had a by-the-book cop played by Wong Man-tak having to work in Mongkok, and he was kind of getting perverted in a way by the long-time cop of Mongkok played by Anthony Wong. And so you have a bit this a similar dynamic there in Blood of the Wolves, with a menace a bit stronger in the Japanese film rather than in the Hong Kongese film. The Hong Kongese film was quite optimistic by today's standards, I guess, and that was because Gordon Chan wanted it to be like this. He wanted to be optimistic about the future of Hong Kong cinema, and in the case of Blood of Wolves, it's a little bit more pessimistic, I would say, but still a very good performance also from all the cast, basically, and so very slick. A few twists there and there, so that you have some surprise when you watch it. So really very good film if you want to keep the Yakuza flame alive. The second one, in my opinion, is slightly less good. It's still a good film. It's still recommended if you are into a Yakuza film, so you should still check it out. But I found it a little bit more predictable because everything centers around the main antagonist, with kind of a psychopath Yakuza, and in a way it makes him a bit more predictable, and it makes the story as a whole slightly more predictable than the first one. But it's still very well made, and it's still worth if you are into Yakuza film, especially given that nowadays, as I say, there are much less Yakuza films being produced. So when you have this kind of quality product, you should certainly go watch it, and you should also check the other movie I talked, which was made around the same time, which is Yakuza and the Family, which I think is a good sum up of the evolution of Yakuza in Japanese society, and with also emblematic in a way of what the Japanese cinema can make for Yakuza film nowadays. Then I had several questions from Giuseppe Zamparutti, who asked me about films like A Cult Is My Passport, A Cruel Gun Story, or Branded to Kill. Are those films really Yakuza films, given that it is a bit unclear, and shouldn't they be classified as gangster films rather than Yakuza films? And Giuseppe's question is actually very legit and very valid, and I must confess I actually asked myself the same question when I was dealing with the time of after war until the Ninkyo, so roughly the 50s, early 60s, because indeed it's never very clear if the different gangsters we see in those films are really Yakuza. It seems like they are more borrowed from American films, this kind of noir films from the decade earlier, the 40s, the 30s, or some of them in the 50s as well. And they seem to be more from those kind of films, or they seem to go in the direction of James Bond, more like some kind of a secret super organization trying to maybe not conquer the world, but something like this kind of super international organization, which is much more phantasmagoric in a way than the Yakuza themselves. And the same goes for Drunken Angel, the one by Akira Kurosawa, in which Toshiro Mifune could be a Yakuza, but it could be also just a small-time gangster from a very specific district without any Yakuza affiliation. It's never clearly said in the film. So indeed, when we are classifying those films into Yakuza films, that's quite often a simplification. They should be called gangster films rather than Yakuza films. Having said that, there are some practical reasons for me to have put a film like Drunken Angel in my example of Yakuza film. First, because there are actually not many films around that time which are easily available showing gangsters in Japan during the occupation time, so at the end of 45 until 52, 53. And so in a way Drunken Angel was convenient to include for me because this way I had some footage, I had something to show in my video. So that was a simplification which was practical in a way. And the other reason which motivated me to put it in the video as a Yakuza film is that the film is actually reviewed in the Mark Schilling Yakuza movie book. And as it is kind of the reference about Yakuza films, I thought, well, if he puts it there, I guess I can put it in my video as well. But still, the question remains, and indeed they should be more qualified as gangster films rather than Yakuza films. And so comes the second question, which is, in this case, why Japanese cinema during this 50s decade didn't show clearly Yakuza and show them under another light. They only showed Yakuza when it came to older time, when it came to the end of the Tokugawa period or the Meiji era, this kind of time, basically the 19th century or the early 20th century. And unfortunately, I must confess, I do not have an answer to this question. I have no idea why Japanese cinema was so reluctant for a while to show contemporary Yakuza. I'm guessing, but it's just a guess there, that it may have something to do with the instructions given by the occupation authority during the time of the American occupation. I guess that they gave instruction to the film industry to not portray Yakuza in any positive light, and so that reduced the possibility of showing Yakuza in a contemporary environment. And there were maybe some stigma still left after the American left Japan that prevented Japanese filmmakers to show a Yakuza in a modern environment. But that's just my guess. I haven't been able to find a clear indication on this subject if that was indeed the reason. So the question remains open so far. So if you know about it, if you have any idea, don't hesitate to put it in the comment section. That will certainly be helpful for anybody who is interested about this subject. Then came two follow-up questions from Giuseppe. In one, he was asking if any gangster in Japan is a Yakuza, and the question is, of course, no. There are other kind of gangsters in Japan which are not affiliated to the Yakuza. They have actually been made into subgenre when it comes to the Yakuza film. There are the Sukeban, for example, which are about female delinquent. There are the Crow Zero series, so once again, delinquent at school. You have also, of course, some gangsters which are just working in Japan and who are not necessarily linked to the Yakuza. Having said that, if you want to have an organization of a considerable size, if you want to have bigger operations, it becomes almost unavoidable to either become affiliated to a Yakuza family or to create your own. You have a few who kind of avoid this kind of situation, but they are more like the foreign gang. There are, for example, some Chinese gangs, there are some Iranian gangs, these kind of things. So they are not Yakuza, but they tend to associate, to gather anyway in order to gain a bit of strength. And you also have some Korean gangs. It's a bit more complicated when it comes to the Koreans in Japan because they are known as the Zanishi, and they have been Japan for usually at this point several generations, but they are still kind of discriminated in Japan. And there have actually been some studies showing that Yakuza have a proportion of Zanishi in their rank higher than the rest of a normal enterprise, normal company, so normal working active society. And in a way, I guess it makes sense, as they are discriminated, they tend to go more easily into crime. So the answer is no, there are indeed other people, other gangsters who are not affiliated to the Yakuza, but as soon as you want to become bigger and you want to be ambitious, it's kind of unavoidable to become one or to get into the orbit of another Yakuza family. And the last question from Giuseppe is about Branded to Kill, and he was wondering if Branded to Kill was in a way the prototype for the Jitsuroku, with characters who are actually not following the Yakuza code, and this kind of gang war, this kind of ambitions from different subgroup into from the same Yakuza family, this kind of stories, which are indeed quite prevalent in Jitsuroku. So there is indeed a common point between Branded to Kill and the Jitsuroku in the way they show how actually Yakuza don't really care about this Yakuza code, and they are ready to do anything in order to get money for their own ambitions. So there is this common point indeed. Having said that, I would argue that Branded to Kill is not really a film which announced the Jitsuroku for other reasons, and mainly for stylistic reasons. Branded to Kill is a film which is very stylized. It's almost like creating another world, a bit out of this world, very aesthetic. The Jitsuroku is not like this at all. It has, on the contrary, it tries to really stick to reality. It's usually adapted from real stories, and it adopts a documentary style. So it really tries to be as realistic as possible, and that's the complete antithesis of Branded to Kill, which is completely cinematic, completely out of this world compared to the normal Jitsuroku film, at least the one which were highly popular during the 70s. And I think that's a big difference which prevents Branded to Kill to be really considered as a Jitsuroku film. Still, that can be argued. Maybe some of you will disagree with me and agree more with Giuseppe. So once again, don't hesitate to bring some arguments if you want to discuss this subject. Then we come to a comment from Mohamed, who was highlighting the fact that when I was talking about Heroic Bloodshed being the descendant in a way of a Ninkyo film, so Heroic Bloodshed from Hong Kong, the John Woo kind of films, being the next step, the cultural appropriation of Hong Kong from Japan. He mentioned the fact that the club directed by Kirk Wong was also a film which was in a way the direct descendant of the Ninkyo films, the Ninkyo craze from the second half of the 60s, early 70s. And he's right indeed. I mean, Kirk Wong has used many elements from the Ninkyo in the club, and the club is on many ways the gangster film which really announced all the gangster films in Hong Kong for the 20 to 30 years which followed. So there is no surprise that the club indeed borrow a lot of elements from Ninkyo. It's also fascinating to notice that in the club we have a Japanese lady being involved in the casting, being the main lady from Michael Chan. Michael Chan used a katana in the film as well, so that may be a direct reference to Ninkyo film there. And last but not least, it's interesting to know that Michael Chan, as you may already be aware, is a former triad leader, and from my understanding he had quite some solid ties with the Yamaguchi-gumi, the Yamaguchi-gumi being one of the #1 family of Yakuza in Japan. They are based in Osaka and Kobe. They are very famous, or infamous should I say, and yeah, there were some connections between Michael Chan and the Yamaguchi-gumi, so in a way maybe that's through this channel that the club was made, or just because Kirk Wong was fond of this kind of Japanese Ninkyo film. The question remains open, but what is certain is that the club is indeed the kind of missing link between the Ninkyo from Japan and the Heroic Bloodshed from Hong Kong, the movie which really make the link between the two. And the last interesting comment comes from Nekoala, who highlighted the fact that Juzo Itami, the director of Minbo, so the movie from 1992, which was kind of making fun of Yakuza, taking a comedic light to denounce the Yakuza action and the way they were trying to scam and to get money from the normal public. He wanted to highlight the fact that Juzo Itami was suicided, was killed by a Yakuza gang. It's true, but maybe it needs a bit more explanation. So officially, Juzo Itami killed himself because there was a newspaper which was going to publish the fact that he had an affair outside of his wedding, obviously, and so in order to avoid the scandal, so he killed himself. So that's the official story behind his death. But there is a very strong noise, a very strong rumor which has been in the air for a very long time that it was not a suicide and he was actually killed by a Yakuza gang. And the one who is supposedly responsible of this death is called Tadamasa Goto, and he was a former member of the Yamaguchi-gumi. It seems he was also the guy responsible for Juzo Itami being beaten up just after the release of Minbo. So in 1992, Juzo Itami went to his car, to the parking in front of his house, and then he was beaten up, he was slashed, and he stayed in the hospital for a little while after that. And supposedly that was the making of Tadamasa Goto, who was not happy about the way he had described Yakuza. So clearly the Yakuza can be dangerous people, and when you are doing films which are not showing them in a very positive light, you are taking risk. But it's a good thing, obviously, that Juzo Itami did it. Unfortunately, it seems to have paid a very heavy price for that. And I can really recommend very strongly watching Minbo. I think it's a great film. It's one of my favorite Yakuza film. I really love the way it deconstructs the way the Yakuza are trying to scam or trying to intimidate people so that they can get as much money as possible. And it's actually very interesting to be aware that the Minbo, so the Minbo, which gives the title to Juzo Itami's film, it was a practice which was extremely present in the 1980s in Japan. Before that, it seems like that was not that frequent. So what is Minbo? So Minbo is just Yakuza people going into a normal shop, restaurant, whatever, and who are going to complain of whatever they can complain. So if they are in a restaurant, if they have ordered soup, they will say, oh, there is a fly in my soup, so I want to be compensated. And then they will show their muscle, and then they will make a mess, and so that will push the owner of the restaurant to give them money. And they can do any kind of this kind of scam. That's exactly what is called Minbo. And they were actually very creative in the 1980s when they were doing this kind of practice. They came up with a lot of ways in order to get money from the general public. And actually this Minbo was so present and so unpopular that it's one of the reasons which pushed the Japanese government in the early 90s to have this anti-gang law. The anti-gang law was actually passed fairly quickly in Japan, and with almost no opposition, at least from the political parties. There were a few critics, some people who thought that would be counterproductive, some people who thought it didn't go far enough. But in general, it was quite welcomed by most of the political parties and most of the population. And it is argued by some scholars that it was accepted so easily, this law, because of Minbo, because of how it had damaged the image of the Yakuza to the general audience. There are some other factors as well, of course, but Minbo seems to have been high on the list when it comes to the reason which pushed the government to have this law passed. And supposedly after it was passed, indeed Minbo has become much less present, much less active compared to what it was in the 1980s. If you are interested about Minbo, or if you want to really know into detail how the Yakuza were doing their business, what kind of business they had, the impact of the law, on how the law actually was discussed, how it was decided to have this kind of measure or not another kind, I can recommend you very strongly reading the book Japanese Mafia, Yakuza Law on the State by Peter Hill. It's really a great book to know more about all this, and of course I used it extensively when I did my own video. It's a bit, it's not the easiest reading you can have. It's a bit academic sometimes, so it's a bit heavy, but it's really worth the effort if you are interested in this subject. It's highly recommended if you have any interest about the way Yakuza are into Japanese society and how they are dealt with. Now I have finished about the questions or the comments I had about the video, which I thought were interesting to dig a bit deeper. Now I'm going to just ramble and just discuss a bit about some of the choices, some of the things I did in the video, because sometimes when you do such a video, you need to simplify things. You cannot really go into details. So I'm going to go into deeper details here and just discuss about several choices I made, some of my own preferences, and I'm going to recommend you also many more Yakuza films which for whatever reason I wasn't able to include in the main video. So the first thing I want to say is that when I talk about the typical structure of a Ninkyo film, I should precise that I was specifically targeting the Toei production. This formula I talk about is really specific to Toei production. And I may sound a bit critical on this formula, and indeed, I mean, there is obviously some kind of repetitivity there, but it is a formula which was working. It was efficient, and indeed, if you apply it seriously from the beginning to the end, you are almost sure to have a decent film at the end. But if you want to check Yakuza films, Ninkyo films, which are not in this mold, then you should check the other studio which were producing Yakuza films, and I'm thinking here mostly to Nikatsu and Dai. They were more original, they were trying different things much more than Toei comparatively. But that also means that by going into a new direction, their films can be sometimes better than the Toei production, but sometimes also much worse. So the spectrum is wider when you are checking Nikatsu and Dai Ninkyo films, while with Toei you are almost sure to have something which is at the very least entertaining, sometimes real good, but very rarely bad. And so when it's Dai or Nikatsu, it's a bit more random. But it's still worth the effort because, as I say, they can be more original and there are some real hidden gem there to look for. And one such a gem is a film called A Gambler's Life Unstoppable Bloodbath. What a title. Also known as A Gambler's Life, The Massacring Fudo. It was directed by Kimiyoshi Yasuda in 1969 and it's a Dai production. It's an Ninkyo I really like, and the main attraction in a way is the darkness that there is on the film. Darkness and also the aesthetic. I mean, it's beautifully shot. I used a couple of shots in my own video. But it's really beautiful. The framing is perfect. The way the camera moves is extremely slick and elegant. It's really beautiful from the beginning to the end. But what makes it that interesting, I think, is the performance by Raizo Ishikawa. Raizo Ishikawa was a big star in Japan around that time. He had been in many period films during the 50s and 60s. Samurai films, ninja films. He was really a big star. Unfortunately, when he did A Gambler's Life, Unstoppable Bloodbath, he was quite sick and he was really on the verge of death. He did another movie and then he passed away after. I think he was in his early 40s. And he was already aware of that when he did this movie. And I think it really shows in a way. His character looks really depressed. He looks like he knows he's going to die soon, and that was certainly the case in real life, but it really shows in the character as well. And so it gives the film an atmosphere of a mood which is like almost end of the world, almost apocalyptic in a way. Which is very heavy, but which is also very fitting for the story which is being told, and so that makes for quite an unforgettable film. It's really mesmerizing. Maybe not for the good reason, because it's obviously very sad that the death and the sickness of Raizo Ishikawa contributed so much to the quality of the film. We would prefer that it's just for fake, it's just for the fun, and the people who do those films are not in such a dying state. But that was the case, and it indeed, I think, had an impact, a positive impact in a way, on the film, and it makes for quite a high quality Ninkyo film, and I really recommend you to check it. I also wanted to have a little talk about the two main actors of Ninkyo, at least the two biggest ones, and the one who were linked to Toei. That is Koji Tsuruta and Ken Takakura. Many people prefer Ken Takakura, and for good reasons, because Ken Takakura, contrary to Koji Tsuruta, he managed to kind of escape the Ninkyo curse, if I can put it this way, meaning that after the Ninkyo, when the Ninkyo were no longer trendy, he managed to keep his career alive, keep his career active and going by becoming associated to a more intellectual director. He worked quite a few times with Yoji Yamada, he worked with other directors, and he became a dramatic actor, a serious dramatic actor. He also became around that time the favorite actor from Hollywood productions, which led him into Black Rain or Mr. Baseball with Tom Selleck. So he really managed to keep his career very much alive, very successful. So that's probably why we tend to remember Ken Takakura more than Koji Tsuruta, who really suffered from the Ninkyo curse. He never managed after the Ninkyo to be into other kind of films. He was always into Yakuza films, and usually films which were trying to resuscitate in a way the Ninkyo era, with not so much success for the most part. Which is a bit sad, because Koji Tsuruta actually was not a bad actor. It can be argued that he had a lesser range than Ken Takakura, but still he proved in the film he did in the 50s, very early 60s, that he could play other parts than just Yakuza Ninkyo guy. He did many other kind of drama for Toei. So in a way it's a bit too bad he wasn't able to escape from the Ninkyo craze. But on the other hand, if you look back at those films, I do think that Koji Tsuruta in a way was even more convincing than Ken Takakura when he was playing this kind of Yakuza hero. He seemed to have the perfect attitude, the perfect way to portray it, rather than Ken Takakura. Sometimes, in my opinion, he looked a bit too much like droopy. I mean, it's like he had all the sorrow of earth on his back, and sometimes he was slightly lacking in this kind of noble attitude which the Ninkyo hero is supposed to have. I'm not saying that Ken Takakura was a bad actor for the Ninkyo. He remains one of the icons of the Ninkyo era, and he did most of the time a very good job. But if we have to compare them, I would give a slight edge to Koji Tsuruta when it came to Ninkyo film. That can be argued. Once again, some people may prefer Ken Takakura, but I just wanted to share my own preference and give a bit of love to Koji Tsuruta, who is kind of forgotten nowadays, but I really think he was perfect to play this kind of heroic Yakuza during the Ninkyo era. Another actor who is completely forgotten when it comes to Ninkyo film, but which I really like, and I wanted to mention it a little bit, it's Ryo Ikebe. He is the usual partner of Ken Takakura in the Brutal Tales of Chivalry series, and he had a few parts where he was a few films where he was playing the leading part, the leading Ninkyo Yakuza hero, and I think he has a very good face to play this kind of characters. He is a pretty good actor as well, so I would like to give a bit of love to Ryo Ikebe as well. And if you want to check Ryo Ikebe in Yakuza films, I really strongly urge you to watch Pale Flower, directed by Masahiro Shinoda, which is not your average Yakuza film of that time. It's not really a Ninkyo film. It is a Yakuza film. But it's not a Ninkyo. Still, it's a very fascinating film, which has a bit of a French new wave vibe to it. We follow Ryo Ikebe with a former Yakuza who has been released from jail, and he's still gravitating in this Yakuza universe, but he's reluctant to get back into the business as well, and then he's going to meet a young, pretty lady who is into gambling. She likes to do crazy stuff basically, and she has her kick participating in very expensive illegal gambling games. And so those two characters, who are very different, are going to associate in a way, and that makes for a very interesting journey with a beautiful black and white. The direction of Masahiro Shinoda is really of high quality, very slick, and so we have a very original Yakuza film, which is certainly worth a look. If you are looking for the classic Ninkyo film, you will be disappointed, but if you want a Yakuza film different from what was being mass produced back then, you should really check it. There is a good chance you will like it. Now let's talk a little bit more about the Jitsuroku. So Jitsuroku, maybe you have noticed it from the video I did, it's the subgenre of Yakuza film which I love the most. I'm a big fan of Jitsuroku film. Obviously the Kinji Fukasaku ones, but there are actually quite a few others which are quite decent. So I highlighted Okinawa Yakuza War by Sadao Nakajima. I already talked a little bit about Okinawa Yakuza War when I did the Sonichiba retrospective. I may have sounded a bit critical, and I'm still a little bit critical about it, but I still think it's a very decent, very watchable Jitsuroku film, so it's certainly worth checking if you like this kind of Yakuza films. You also had Violent City by Hideo Gosha. I must precise with Violent City that the movie is very uneven. It's far from a great film. It has a lot of problems. First, because its story is quite generic. There is really nothing new there. Hideo Gosha sometimes also tends to play the clock, to have some scenes which extend a little bit too long to my taste. And there is a last problem when it comes to Violent City, which is Noboru Ando. So Noboru Ando is playing the main guy, the main hero in Violent City, and you may not be aware of it, but he was a former Yakuza himself. Former or not, it's up to debate. But anyway, he appeared because of this affiliation in many Yakuza films. And let's be clear, he's great when he's playing as a supporting actor. He has a face which is really good for Yakuza film with a scar. That's really perfect. And I really like him when he's playing supporting parts in those Jitsuroku film. But here the problem is that he is the leading man. And it really shows that he is not the best of actor. His acting range, his acting ability is fairly limited. And I think that's a flaw of the film. I mean, that tends to pull down the film a little bit. So there are some problems, obviously, with Violent City, but at the same time, there are some beautiful things as well. Hideo Gosha, when he wants to do things, he really has an eye for making them a bit different, making them more interesting than your average director. And here it really shows with a series, for example, of murder, which is made by a transsexual, and all these murders are shown in a way which is quite reminiscent of Dario Argento's Giallo. And so that's really quite impressive to see this kind of Giallo scene in a Jitsuroku Yakuza film. And there are many of these kind of very inspired directional choices by Hideo Gosha. There is a very violent action scene fight in a place full of chicken. It seems Hideo Gosha, for whatever reason, have a fetish for chicken. He did the same with Hunter in the Dark, which I already talked about in the Sonichiba retrospective, which is also a Yakuza film, period Yakuza in this case. A very good film as well. So yeah, you should check Violent City just because there is this kind of glimpse of genius in a way from Hideo Gosha, and you should be more lenient when it comes to the many flaws that the film also has. But while we are at it, I would like to advise you two other Jitsuroku films which I think are really worth a look. One of them is Authentic True Account Osaka Shock Tactics, directed by Sadao Nakajima. Again, Sadao Nakajima, the director of Okinawa Yakuza War. It's fairly classic. I mean, it's a war of gangs, the usual thing you can expect from a Jitsuroku film, but it's extremely well made. It's very active. It really tries to up the violence and the sex, and that's components which are very important when it comes to Jitsuroku films. So it's also very fast when it comes to the rhythm, which is something I really appreciate. And we also have another actor who is very good when it comes to Jitsuroku films. I already sang many praises from for Bunta Sugawara in the Battle Without Honor on Humanity. It represents for me the quintessential Jitsuroku actor. But there is another actor who I think is extremely good when it comes to Jitsuroku film. His name is Hiroki Matsukata. He is actually an old-timer. He already appeared in Ninkyo film. He also appeared in Ninja film, if you can believe it. But I think he was more fitted for Jitsuroku. He has a face which is very distinctive and which I think is really fitted for Jitsuroku. It's a bit aggressive, and usually the way he acts is quite intense. So it's really perfect for Jitsuroku film, and he is really at the forefront here in True Account, Osaka Shock Tactics. And so that's a joy to watch from the beginning to the end, thanks to this very energetic direction of Sado Nakajima, and thanks to such great actors as Hiroki Matsukata. And another Jitsuroku I wanted to advise is The Tattooed Hitman by Kosaku Yamashita. I already said that I love Bunta Sugawara when he is into Jitsuroku film, and I especially like Bunta when he is acting as the ultimate badass. And if you love Bunta playing badass characters like me, then you should check The Tattooed Hitman. He is at his most badass in this film. As the title say, Bunta is playing an elite hitman from the mob, from the Yakuza, but he's somebody who just cannot accept any shit. So if you talk shit about him, he's going to get back into your face. And if you are lucky, he's just going to slap you. If you are unlucky, he's going to put a bullet in you. And he won't care about who you are. You can be a very influential politician. You can be a very powerful Yakuza boss or a rich businessman. That won't have any importance. That won't have any effect when it comes to Bunta. If you have disrespected him, he's going to get back at you and he will make you pay a heavy price. And that's what The Tattooed Hitman is from the beginning to almost the end. That's basically Bunta not letting any person bullying him and just showing who is the boss, and is really doing it with all the intensity and the class that we can expect from him, and it's a joy to watch. The movie actually also has a few, maybe not twists, but a few surprising choices when it comes to its story. There is some kind of a last third, which is really surprising the way it plays out. I really didn't expect it. It may be a little bit anticlimactic in a way, but it's certainly original, and that gives a bit more personality to the film. If, like me, you enjoy Bunta Sugawara playing badass Yakuza, The Tattooed Hitman is a very must. Now let's talk a little bit about Yakuza film in the 80s. As you can see from the main video, when I talk about this decade of Yakuza film, I was quite critical, and I consider it to be one of the low points of Yakuza films. It seems actually it's not a position which is shared by all of you, because I did a poll on the community page of the channel asking which era was your favorite when it comes to Yakuza film. And the Jitsuroku got the number 1 spot, but the number 2 spot was taken by 80s films. So it seems like there are many of you who actually enjoy Yakuza film from the 80s. So that's interesting to note, and maybe some of you have titles to advise people to watch so that they can have a better understanding and a better liking in a way of this time period for Yakuza films. At the same time, I would like to discuss a little bit further about the Yakuza Ladies series. I already mentioned and I already talked a little bit about the first Yakuza Ladies, directed by Hideo Gosha again. And I think the movie certainly has some qualities, but my problem with the film, I wasn't able to really go into detail in the main video, but here I can do it. My main problem with the first Yakuza Ladies is the storyline of the little sister. So if you haven't seen the first Yakuza Ladies, you have the little sister of Shiwa Iwashita, who is falling in love with a Yakuza, and because of that, a small-time Yakuza, and because of that she will have to confront, she will have to oppose her bigger sister. And this story could be interesting. I mean, there is nothing wrong about this story. What is wrong is the way it is shown, the way this relationship between the little sister and the Yakuza, the small Yakuza she falls in love, happen. First, there is a problem of chemistry between the two actors, but that's not the worst. The worst problem is that the little sister falls in love with the Yakuza because he has raped her. And that's something which has almost a convention of Yakuza, of Japanese cinema, during the 1970s. There are many Japanese films from that era which were using this kind of narrative device, having the main character rape a lady, and then the lady would fall in love with the guy. And that was already, I was going to say borderline, it's actually more than borderline. That was already very bad taste and not a good thing to do in the 70s, but doing it in the 80s, in my opinion, is even worse, because in the 70s it was almost a trend. I mean, many films were doing it, so you could just explain it by, well, that's how many other films do, so we just do it the same way. But in the 80s, fortunately, that was no longer the case. So for Hideo Gosha to use this concept again there is completely out of place. It's really bad. It's not needed. I mean, I think that the story would have been much better if the little sister and the Yakuza had just fallen in love in a normal way. Then that would have been more convincing. And if there was a real reason for them to be in love with each other, because that's not really the case. During the whole film, the Yakuza is treating her very badly, and she still come back to him. There is really no reason for her to be so much into him and to be ready to go as far as to oppose older sister. And so that's really a big problem for me. And this storyline really prevent the first Yakuza Lady to be a really good Yakuza film, and just makes it average plus Yakuza film, if we can say that. I haven't seen the whole Yakuza Ladies series. There are 16 of them. It has been quite productive. I've seen 3 others which actually were all quite decent. They have quite often the same problem, which is they are a bit overlong. They take a bit their time, but still they are. The few others I saw were quite decent. You have to be also aware that those Yakuza Ladies films do not have any link with each other. It's like the other Ninkyo film during that time, the Brutal Tales of Chivalry. I mean, there is no link between the different films. It's just that you have a similar concept. So the concept here being having the ladies, the women of the Yakuza world being at the forefront. And it can be a bit confusing because you have quite often the same actors, but they would, and sometimes some of them would play almost the same character as in the previous film. That's basically what Shima Iwashita did. She's basically always playing the same character, but it's actually a different character in each of the Yakuza Ladies films. So you have to be aware of that. Otherwise, it's going to be very confusing, and you will be wondering why this character is like this, while in the previous film she was like this, or she had a different family link with another actor, character, these kind of things. But anyway, if you have liked the first Yakuza Ladies, you should really check the other film of the series. I kind of like the Shin Yakuza Ladies. I don't remember right now the title in English. I will put it under in the video when I will be doing the editing. But it was pretty good, directed once again by Sadao Nakajima. and he did really a decent job. It had a bit of a soap opera vibe because it's a lot of betrayal into the family. So it's inside the Yakuza family, but inside the real family as well. But that made for quite a powerful drama also in a way. And so yeah, I would recommend you, if you have liked the original Yakuza Ladies, to check the others. And if you are really into Yakuza films, I think the Yakuza Ladies series is decent enough to be worth having a look at. And to finish this follow-up video, I will also talk a bit briefly about the Yakuza film in the 90s. And I would like to discuss a bit more about Takashi Miike. So Takashi Miike is the big name when it comes to a Yakuza film around that time with Takeshi Kitano. As you can see from the main video, my own preference is more on the more classical Yakuza film made by Miike. I already talked about Ambition Without Honor, I already talked about Deadly Outlaw Rika. So films, Yakuza films which have more to do with the Jitsuroku kind of films from the 70s rather than the most crazy, insane film like Yakuza, Full Metal Yakuza, sorry, or Gozu, even if Gozu actually is quite entertaining. But yeah, clearly I prefer when he is a bit more classical. And actually the Miike film I prefer when it comes to Yakuza are not necessarily his most known. I actually enjoy very much Blues Harp, the story, a friendship story between an ambitious Yakuza and a little guy who wants to make it as a musician, as a singer. And that's I find it's a very touching story. In general, I must confess, when it comes to Miike, I prefer when he does this kind of coming of age story about childhood, about coming of age, about this kind of drama, rather than when he goes into the complete craziness. I found this movie more touching, a bit more true at heart compared to when he's just trying to shock people. So Blues Harp, have a look at it. I really found it very well made and very appealing in a way. You are really touched about the story being told there. I would like also to recommend the Man in White duology. It's a bit similar to Agitator, which he did around the same time with the same actor, with Masaya Kato as the lead, and with a smaller budget it seems that Agitator, but I found the Man in White more appealing because he really went high on the action. He really went very hard on the action, and that makes it a bit more entertaining. Agitator is a bit bloated sometimes, a lot of talk which can be quite boring. That's something which you often have in Yakuza films. You should not expect Yakuza films to be all action. That's really not the case. There are a lot of discussions, a lot of drama involved. So it's not that surprising that Agitator has so much of it, but still you need to find the right balance. And I think in Agitator he goes a little bit too much on the dull side. And in the Man in White series, he decided to go more onto the action side, and he does it pretty well. Only problem, it's not really a problem, but it's a stylistical choice. He chose to have it shot in a very Bourne Identity kind of way, a bit the Paul Greengrass shaky cam, where so all the time you would have the camera which is constantly moving. That's not my favorite kind of direction, but at least he's true to the concept, and he really does it from the beginning to the end, and sometimes it is quite efficient. So yeah, at the end of the day, I would say that the Man in White duology is pretty good. And when I say duology, it's two films, but it's actually exactly the same story. There is a continuity there. It's like one film made into two. So 3 hours of Yakuza shooting each other by Takashi Miike. Sounds pretty good, right? So yeah, have a look at it. Another director I didn't mention when I talk about Yakuza film in the 90s, another director who is interesting to check, it's Rokuro Mochizuki. He is unfortunately kind of forgotten now because he he managed to make an impression in the second half of the 90s doing Yakuza films, but for whatever reason it never really transformed it and became successful as a director in the 2000s, and he has been kind of forgotten since. He originally came from AV, adult video, so porn video, but he moved into more conventional filmmaking during the 90s, and he did several Yakuza films, and they are quite interesting to watch. I especially like Onibi and Another Lonely Hitman, which are basically variations on the same concept. Each time you have a Yakuza who is coming out of prison after having killed somebody, and he wants to have a normal life, but because he has still he's a bit old school, he's still a bit following this kind of old school Yakuza values, he ends up getting back into the business, not necessarily for the best. And you have great performances, you have characters which are really interesting to watch, and movies which are which have a bit of a spleen, slightly depressive in a way, but I would say in a good way, which makes you really want to know more about the drama, and which makes you want to follow those characters. He was quite successful with these two films, and they are really worth checking if you are into Yakuza film, in my opinion. He did another one which is called Yakuza in Love, which I found much less interesting, much less successful when it comes to its artistic value. But the two others are certainly worth a look, so check them, and maybe we can hope one day he will do a comeback in the Yakuza film genre. And then with a very last film I wanted to advise you to watch, a film from 1992 directed by Seiji Izumi, and it's called A Legend of Turmoil. A Legend of Turmoil is basically the synthesis of all the other decade which had been at the forefront before. So when I'm saying that, I mean that you have a little bit of Ninkyo in the main character, you have a little bit of Jitsuroku when it comes to this kind of power struggle in the Yakuza, and you also have a little bit of this feminization which I took from the 80s with female characters who really have an impact on the story, who are really present and not just some flower pot. And so it managed to bring all these sometimes contradictory tendencies into one film which still makes sense, which still is coherent. I mean, there is no problem of tone shift. It still managed to make it logical and for you to be invested in. And it has also a great performance by Akira Kobayashi. Akira Kobayashi is an old-timer when it comes to Yakuza film. He was already in some Ninkyo films, he did also some Jitsuroku film, and he always gave a good performance in all these films, but I found him extremely good here in Legend of Turmoil. I find him even more charismatic. He has also a bit gained in size. He's a bit more massive, and I think that really helps to create the character in A Legend of Turmoil, to really show that he is like the boss here, he's the guy in charge, and he's not going to let yourself fuck with him, and he will go back at you. And I really found him great in the film. There is also a very small Hong Kong inspiration when it comes to some of the action. You have a very well made gunfight attack of a Yakuza office, which has a little bit of this Hong Kong vibe to it. So really, with this movie, Seiji Izumi really take from every aspect of Yakuza film, including from elsewhere than Japan, and he managed to make it one very good film, which doesn't suffer from its many different inspirations. So A Legend of Turmoil, a very good surprise, at least for me, when I watch it, and I really want you to try to find it and try to watch it, because if you are into Yakuza film, I'm pretty much sure you are going to enjoy it as much as I did. And that's it. I finished this follow-up video, which as usual with me, is way too long. Maybe it's because, as you may have noticed, I'm very fond of Yakuza film. That's a genre I really enjoy. So it's kind of a joy for me to be able to discuss about it and to spread the love for the Yakuza film. The Yakuza film is much more than the Yakuza themselves. I think the distinction needs to be made. But so that's it for this follow-up video on Yakuza films. I hope you will check some of the films that I advised you. I hope you will enjoy them. And I will see you very soon on another video of the House of Asian Cinema. Until then, take care.